But he wouldn't confirm any specific details at this point in time. Also listening to that, and with me here in the studio, Olivier Guita. He is the Managing Director of Global Strat, an international risk and geopolitical risk consultancy firm. Why didn't we get any confirmation there about whether or not this attack had reached its conclusion?
It looks like it's very sketchy what happened, and I think that they're looking into possibly the ID of the person and looking into his background and knowing his whereabouts. So most likely than not, they will find out, because he's alive as well, as I understand, that probably they'll get intel more quicker than in other attacks. But a couple of things are worth mentioning in terms of coincidence or not. This is the one-year anniversary of the Brussels attack, but it is also the day where in Washington the anti-Islamic State coalition is meeting.
Yes, so perhaps some symbolism there, some parallels to be drawn in terms of the timing. What about the location of this attack? It seems to be... It seems to want to send a very strong message to sort of focus on the heart of power here in the UK.
Right, it's very symbolical, and you know, we've all been talking about soft targets for a while, that terrorists would not try to hit major landmarks because, for instance, the UK Parliament is very well protected. So, in all evidence, this alleged terrorists would have known that there would be a lot of security and that it would mean a lot to attack on a Wednesday when the Prime Minister was also in Parliament.
That's right, she was there, and of course lawmakers were then told to stay inside their offices and to restrict their movements. Because initially, as you would expect with something like this, a great deal of uncertainty as to what was happening. But certainly there is a strong security presence with heavily armed police out around this Parliament building anyway. But it certainly wasn't long before we saw ambulances and an ambulance helicopter land and paramedics tend to the wounded. Nadim Barber is in central London for us. Nadim, what can you tell us?
Well, Mario, you can probably see people still walking behind me. They've apparently come from the area known as Whitehall, near Parliament. Lots of office workers who are still being evacuated from their places of work. There's a large area that's been closed to traffic now around here, and there's the nearest underground station which is out of action as well. You might be able to hear the police helicopter which is circulating. It's flying around the area as well. Not so long ago, of course, there was an air ambulance which landed near Parliament to take some of those injured people away. What we were hearing in that press conference by the Metropolitan Police suggesting that the source at the nearest hospital, St Thomas's Hospital, is right. That source there spoke to a news agency saying that one woman had been killed and several people taken to hospital, some of them with catastrophic injuries, in their words, after an incident on Westminster Bridge. We also know that a car crashed into the wall or the gate of the Houses of Parliament itself. Perhaps that was unrelated. The police haven't actually linked all of these events together, and they're remaining extremely cautious not to give precise figures of how many people have been injured. There was a police officer down at Parliament, we know that. Like many people around the country now, lots of these people are just on their phones, following social media, looking at photos on Twitter and other social media sites to see what's happening elsewhere in the capital. We were just hearing from the police that they're deploying lots of extra police officers to make people feel safe as they head home into the evening in the British capital. Of course, people will be reminded, if they live in London, of what happened on what's known as 7/7, the attacks on the transport system in London in July 2005. For now, the casualty figures are fluid, but it's clear that the police are are treating this as a terrorist incident. They're not saying whether it's ongoing or not. They're being very, very cautious. Interestingly, the person who spoke in the last few minutes wasn't the acting commissioner, because, as that spokesperson was saying, the acting commissioner was actually a witness, was near the scene of the attacks earlier on, and was not injured, but it was considered not appropriate for him to actually give that press conference.
All right, thank you very much, Nadeem Barber, bringing us all the latest there from Westminster. Olivia Gita still with me in the studio, and as Nadeem was pointing out, there is some ambiguity as to what initially took place. We know about reports of an alleged assailant being shot by police after charging at the gates of the Palace of Westminster with a knife. It might have been a long knife or a machete, but almost simultaneously, there was a vehicle driven across Westminster Bridge that appeared to be deliberately targeting the civilians, the pedestrians in its path.
Correct. I mean, at this point, I've seen conflicting reports that it might likely be the same man or two different men. Until now, we don't know. But this modus operandi is exactly the one that has been called from former spokesman of Islamic State al-Adnani since 2014. Use your car, use knives. And unfortunately, that's what we've seen. And security services knew that an attack was imminent. It was not of a if, but of a when. I mean, they foiled a lot of attacks. But unfortunately, what we've seen in Paris and Brussels and Berlin was bound to happen in London as well.
What are the obstacles to identifying attacks like these, to preempting them?
The main issue is human intelligence, and the British services are boasting that they have a good handle on various communities and have people that are helping them, but one will go through the cracks. But until you get the intel ahead of time, it's clearly impossible to just stop people from driving around or walking around.
And that encapsulates right there the enormity of the challenge facing governments and intelligence agencies, not just here in the UK, but across the continent and beyond, because we mustn't forget that, you know, there are attacks that take place targeting civilians. We've seen them in Turkey, we've seen them in the Middle East. But in terms of, you know, the challenges facing European intelligence agencies, it all comes down to your human intelligence, who you know, what connections you have, and how you can harness that knowledge.
Right. I mean, you're exactly on target. The issue that we have now is that compared to after 9/11, the number of potential terrorists in our midst has really multiplied in a fashion that, you know, in the UK, we're talking about potentially 3,000 potential jihadists. We're talking of 15,000 in France. Those are a huge number, and obviously security services have just a limited power in terms of the people that they can follow, track, monitor, and that's a huge undertaking.
And is there anywhere particular in the region where the resources are coming under particular strain?
The main issue is manpower more than, you know, material. The manpower to be able to
the expertise more so than the technology? Exactly.
And unfortunately, in the UK and the US, the main idea was to use electronic intelligence rather than human intelligence. We're going back to the basics now because of all the attacks, and they're looking at human intel because you're talking about individuals that are, you know, not really in an organized cell, which was the model after 9/11, and it was easier for security services to infiltrate cells rather than individuals that just are inspired by Islamic State or Al-Qaeda to go and attack people.
And so, therefore, our intelligence agencies, the way in which they're structured and the way these resources are deployed, is it fit for purpose?
They will have to adapt, and that's what, you know, for instance, France is doing. France had the best human intelligence until 2008. They prided themselves on focusing on human intelligence rather than electronic. Then former President Sarkozy decided to scrap this and go towards the UK-US model. But now for instance, the French are going back to basics, and I suspect that there will be a lot more of that in the coming years. But it's not an overnight operation. You cannot build a huge network of people helping you get information in just one day.
And a difficult question to answer, Olivier, but I'm interested to know how difficult is it to clarify the credibility of one's sources?
You're right. I mean, the only thing that they're looking at, and I can speak of experience of having looked at many different cases in France, for instance, the way you know it is when you know somebody's risking their lives to give you information. And in some cases, some informers decided not even to get paid. So when you know somebody's that motivated to help the community,